Dennis Voznesenski, the agriculture analyst at Rabobank. Thanks for joining us again on Flow.
Thanks for having me, Ricky.
Now, the latest agricultural outlook from Rabobank paints a pretty rosy picture for wool producers, partly because people are getting some new threads to go back to work.
Yeah, that's right. So we're forecasting the Eastern Market Indicator to rise 7% on average this year versus the 2021 average. And in terms of values, that's between $13.50 to $1,500 per kilo. The biggest driver from my side is recovering demand for wool and suit imports. And if you look at, taken as an example, the U.S., you're seeing wool and suit imports only 26% below pre-pandemic levels towards the end of last year, compared to earlier in the year when it was 80% below pre-pandemic levels. And if you take France as an example for what's happening in Europe, that actually reached on par with pre-pandemic levels at the end of last year. That's not to say it's all happy days and there's no issues at all. If you look at consumer confidence in the world's two largest markets, the US and China, they're starting to decline. And one of the big reasons would be rising interest rates and concerns from consumers over, okay, if interest rates are going to rise, I have to spend more money on repaying my mortgage. Maybe there might be issues with employment. So they're getting a little bit more concerned, and that would, of course, weigh on sentiment and prices. So that might be one of the main reasons of why we won't see prices getting back to, say, the 2017, 2018 highs. The other factor to consider is that cotton prices have been really strong, and that's supported wool prices over the last year. But cotton prices are actually expected to decline over this year as the new supply comes online. And lastly, in terms of wool production itself, the Australian Wool Forecasting Committee is forecasting 2021-22 production up 8% this year. And as we all know, when production goes up, prices typically go down. So that's something to consider. So overall, still a positive image, but there's some factors to keep in mind through 2022.
What we've seen in the wool market in the last year or so, certainly in more recent times, appears to be that whilst the higher microns are always the talking point, and that's what the indicator's based on, there's something in it for those sort of lower level microns and even the crossbreeds.
Well, so here's the thing. For fine microns, say we go 17 to 21, there's been strong demand and prices have been decent, especially for 17, 18 micron. A lot of that going into the finer suits, the finer apparel. If you compare it to pre-pandemic levels, so what are prices now compared to February 2020? 17 micron, around 27% higher. But as you move to the more coarser microns, they haven't recovered at all. In fact, if you look at 28 micron, it's still 50% below what it was in February 2020. And the reason, some of the reasons based on speaking to people in the trade that I come up with is that, one, conditions are improving, especially on the East Coast. They've already improved seasonal conditions, and hence the wool clip is a bit more coarse this year than in previous years. And then secondly, on the demand side, speaking to people in China, they're saying that some of the apparel or some of the goods that typically coarse wool goes into, they haven't been in high demand during COVID in China. So they bought up a lot of coarse wool before the pandemic. They thought they're going to put it into that fake fur, some overcoats, and they bought up a lot of the coarse wool, processed it into those goods, and then it turned out during the pandemic that it wasn't in high demand. So they have to churn through all that stock for them to then go, okay, we need more coarse wool, and that will support prices. So it might take a little bit longer for those coarser wools to lift like we have seen in the finer ones.
Okay, and when it comes to, I guess, farmers having bales of wool on hand, I've been watching the auctions each week, suspecting there might be some sort of sitting on it for a while as well and waiting for a good opportunity. There seems to be a pretty huge amount of production going on at the moment.
Oh, that's true. Yes, during COVID, when we did see significant decline in prices across the board, a lot of farmers did decide to hold on to more wool, and that's still the case. So we still have to get through all of that wool. The issue is, one of the issues would be, even if farmers wanted to get rid of more than they typically would in any given month, there's the issue around container availability and shipping availability to get that to China. And I was actually speaking recently to a large retailer, to a large company in Europe that sells woolen apparel. And I asked them, do you see any light in the end of the tunnel in terms of supply chain issues, at least on your end? And they said, definitely not in the first half of 2022, maybe in the second half of 2022. But even then, it won't go back to normal this year. So the supply chains won't go back to what we saw before the pandemic this year.
Well, and lastly, it just picked up, I think the federal government announced late last year that they were looking at maybe, whether it's on Australian soil or whether not far away from us, developing more wool processing capability within Australia. I guess that might help when it comes to supply chain issues if more of it's processed closer to home.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I did see that toward the end of last year. Well, one issue has always been that it was cheaper to process wool in China because there was cheaper labor. Now that labor has become more expensive. One of the things, from what I understand, is that the lower processing equipment is incredibly expensive, and that's typically that's not really replaced until it starts. It reaches its useful lifespan. So if you still have 10 years lifespan in that equipment as a company, you wouldn't go and switch it to another region because it's just so expensive. When we move to the end of the lifespan of that equipment in China, maybe there will be opportunities for Australia. That would actually be really good. And yeah, I'll be really keen to see the numbers of how economically we can do it compared to those in other regions like in India or in China.
Well, Dennis, thanks for that information. I think it could be possible that the merino market particularly could be pretty fly for the wool guy based on your estimates this year.
Yeah, it is looking good, but important to keep in mind as we move through the year, those cotton prices are going to start weighing on wool because as more production comes online around the world, there's going to be more cotton around, and that might weigh on wool as we move to the end of the year.
Yeah, thanks again, Dennis. Very important information. Cheers again.